Each sonata in the Opus 2 set of Beethoven's first published solo piano sonatas has 4 movements. None of Mozart's or Haydn's sonatas has 4 movements. In terms of form, idea, sonority, technique, pianism, and scale, these pieces are completely different from all previous piano solo sonatas. With these works, Beethoven created the symphonic piano sonata as a completely new type of solo composition for the piano, a radically new pianism, a new musical vocabulary of expressive markings and Italian terms, and a new sonata process based on thematic evolution. The first theme of the first movement has the classic short, short, long structure. We must present measures 5 through 8 as a single musical unit. We find the characteristic Beethoven accentuation and dynamics in the very first phrase, sforzandos that build to a powerful fortissimo and a diminuendo nuance to piano. In the lead-in to the second theme, Beethoven does something radical. Following the pause, that's the fermata and the rest, Beethoven changes the mode from C major to C minor as he restates the first theme, now in the left hand. The second theme is a 2-voice sequence built from the triplet figure. Listen to the beautiful harmonies that are formed in these measures. The second theme segues into the third theme. Beethoven emphasizes the agogic accent, the B-flat half note, with a dynamic nuance. The extensive use of this dynamic nuance is a Beethoven innovation, a type of accentuation or emphasis that is not as sharply focused as a marcato accent or sforzando. The third theme is heard only once in the first movement. In the fourth theme, we hear a free inversion and transformation of the opening. When written between the staves, the sforzando accent applies to the music in both hands, as in measure 22, within the prevailing dynamic context. In the extension of the fourth theme, Beethoven introduces a new syncopated pattern and uses the dynamic nuance to build to forte for the beginning of the fifth theme. In the fifth theme, we hear the subito piano, a Beethoven innovation and a trademark. The music of the subito piano should still be very clear and integrated within the theme. The music continues in piano, as the great Beethoven interpreter Arthur Schnabel maintained. In the sixth, or closing theme, we find the first use of the words con espressione within a sonata movement rather than as a character indication at the beginning of a movement. This indication for the closing theme of the exposition is a landmark, a new way of communicating a performance psychology from composer to performer. The development begins with a new version of the opening theme and continues with the fourth theme. The next section is the most interesting and most characteristically Beethovenian part of the development section. We hear the sforzandos as interplay between the hands. The syncopations in the left hand are challenged by the sforzandos in the right hand half notes. The syncopations twist and intensify the musical energy. Beethoven's syncopated sforzandos almost always require more energy. As Liszt said in his master classes, remember, syncopated notes should have an obstinate character. For the trill figure in the next passage, begin from the upper note and compress the rhythm, playing the four notes almost simultaneously to achieve the necessary speed. The brilliantly composed passage that takes us back to the opening theme begins with the left-hand portatos. Beethoven recomposes the second theme. We should make a strong crescendo to the beginning of the recapitulation. The exposition began piano, but the recap begins in a dramatic forte, a Beethoven trademark. Beethoven almost always varies the music of the exposition and the recapitulation, in addition to the usual transposition of musical materials. Notice the following important variants. The left-hand chords are solidly on the beat, a much more declamatory effect. Measures 111 following begin with a sustained agogic B-flat. A new passage appears in place of the third theme. Notice the change from the diminished seventh harmony to the German sixth in measure 118. Now the music continues as in the exposition, but the closing and coda in the minor mode, F minor, cast a much darker emotional shadow. The first theme of this beautiful slow movement begins with Beethoven's indication to play dolce. Dolce is surprisingly frequent in Beethoven's music. Do not start in tempo giusto. Let the music begin. Gradually find a very expansive and expressive flow of motion and play with warm tone. The ethereal cantilena of the second theme is supported by the long C pedal tones in the bass and the flowing 16th notes. We hear the spontaneous variation process Beethoven uses to elaborate a phrase. Beethoven repeats the phrase immediately with very improvisatory sounding variation and embellishment. In measure 14, we find rinforzando, a Beethoven invention, play with special emphasis using rubato and greater intensity of tone. With a single embellished tone, the A, Beethoven introduces a completely different emotional world. The third theme, dolente, espressivo. Beethoven segues into the fourth theme. Notice that there is no upbeat here. The two-note slurs we heard in the third theme become much more intensely expressive in the fourth theme. In this theme, Beethoven introduces 32nd note melodic motion that will be incorporated into much of the rest of the movement. The closing theme begins with one of Beethoven's favorite sonorities, the faux bourdon. The faux bourdon is parallel first inversion chords. Here, the faux bourdon strongly suggests the sonority of French horns. The sforzando piano indicates a much more rounded sound without any sharp attack, an expressive accent. Although brief, the coda has an intense and poignant emotion. We must give the nuance in the soprano and the sforzando in the alto strong character and intensity without changing the dynamic levels too much. The final cadence is very sincere and gentle, dolce semplice, nothing perfunctory or matter of fact. In performance, maintain the silence of the final fermata for a moment before releasing the frame. The third movement is in 3/4, but is not really a minuet. There is much greater intensity to the music and an almost Brahmsian sonority of sixths and thirds. Beethoven's allegretto here is in a conducting beat of 1 per bar. Here is the first theme. The subito forte should be integrated into the longer phrase, not a sudden forceful change of sonority. the second theme, be sure to bring the dynamic level all the way down to pianissimo for the echoes at the end of this theme. The third theme begins in maximum dynamic contrast with the pianissimo ending of the second theme. The subito fortissimo passage angrily breaks in. Now we know we are definitely not playing a minuet, but the prototype of the Scherzo movement Beethoven will introduce in the next two solo sonatas. In the fourth theme, the beginning of the first theme is given to the left hand as the right hand challenges the first theme with a new version of the opening motive that has trills. These begin from the principal note. Notice the shift of the sforzando from the first beat to the third beat in measure 34. A somber cadence in pianissimo ends the section. For the beginning of the trio, the fifth theme, Beethoven takes the long slur of the unison passage from the third theme and shapes the moving eighth notes into a four-measure melody. We must slur both the right hand and the left hand. The left hand should not be played as an accompaniment, rather as a counter melody. Just when things were beginning to sound very minuet-like and conventional, we hear a magnificent and very difficult Foldbourdon setting of the fifth theme. Be sure to play the alto, the middle note, with full tone. And the final graceful phrase. Notice the intriguing change from B flat to B natural. In the first theme, we immediately feel the coiled spring tension of Beethoven's powerful dynamic contrasts in the violent opposition of piano versus forte, dynamic dynamite. Prestissimo is somewhat rare in the solo sonatas. The music must still be in a half note, not a whole note pulse. The rhythmic momentum, rather than the sheer speed, is a vital part of Beethoven's faster tempos. The subito piano of the second theme almost sounds manic rather than lyrical. Maintain the tempo and the intensity. In the third theme, Beethoven modifies the first theme. Here, Beethoven hammer chords invade the domain of the solo piano sonatas for the first time. Notice that in measures 16 to 17, fortissimo is indicated twice. Beethoven often repeats forte or fortissimo dynamic markings to show the three chords as one reiterated and emphatic dynamic gesture, a dynamic group instead of a phrase group. In the fourth theme, Beethoven uses a kind of heterophony. The two hands are playing slightly different versions of the same idea. Although Beethoven does not change the dynamic level from fortissimo, we can give the sonority at the beginning of this theme a much darker color, poco meno forte. fifth theme begins in the context of C minor. This is pure Beethoven, unlike anything composed before in sonority or effect. The C minor melody is in octaves all the way through the section. The turbulence of the left hand repeated broken chords combined with the pathos of the right hand produces a very Beethovenian effect, a preview of the last movement of the Moonlight Sonata. For the closing and first ending, Beethoven uses a modified version of the first theme. The fortissimo dynamic stays throughout, and Beethoven composes a new passage for the first ending to take us back to F minor. The chords with intervening rests become the second ending, modulating to the relative major, A flat major, as the lead-in to the sixth theme. The middle section of the fourth movement, marked Sempre piano e dolce, has two large parts. In the first part, we hear the beautiful cantilena of the sixth theme shape each phrase with subtle nuances and inflection. The tone must be very warm, but not overprojected. Beethoven varies the beginning of the sixth theme in octaves, now marking a crescendo nuance and rinforzando. Give more intensity and poco rubato here. Beethoven repeats and varies the last part of the sixth theme and segues directly into the second part of the middle section. The second part of the middle section, measures 109 to 138, is more like a development section with a really interesting dramatic development process. The mood changes suddenly at measure 109. The music begins in A flat major, but sounds much darker and more ominous. Two large compositional elements are juxtaposed. Number one, Beethoven brings back the rhythm of the first theme, now pianissimo, in the right hand. The left hand has the triplet rhythmic pattern of the accompaniment from the opening as a vamp. Two, this music alternates with a musical texture that recalls the sixth theme. The turn in measure 111 and measure 115 should be much more intense than the turn in measure 66. The musical juxtaposition of these opposing characters is repeated on the dominant seventh of F minor. Beethoven is setting up the return of the tonic. Beethoven extends to and radically alters the music with a series of sforzandos in soprano and bass, implying a crescendo to the fortissimo in measure 125. Beethoven always composes interesting variants in the recapitulation of his sonatas. In this movement, Beethoven expands the second theme, alternating the theme between the hands and modulating to the dominant C major. The trill gesture must be rhythmically compressed at the presto tempo. The fourth theme is in the alto and bass and left-hand octaves. We hear a new bass line. In the final section, the closing and coda, Beethoven brings back the first theme, forte, then fortissimo. The left hand plays the chords for the first and only time. The right hand takes the triplets. The music must be vehement and powerful to the end, without a big ritardando.